Final day of Eagles OTAs today. They have minicamp starting next week. And, of course, all eyes will be on Malcolm Jenkins and whether or not he ends up reporting. What's your take on that, Mosher? You think he'll end up coming in?
I think when all is said and done, Malcolm Jenkins will be with the Eagles with an adjusted contract, probably right before the start of either mandatory camp or training camp. And we won't be talking about this on September 1st. That's what I think.
I think you're probably right.
Yeah.
But we'll see if he's there next week.
But if I were like Vegas, I would put like a little like separate category on odds of Malcolm Jenkins retiring. Like, he's not going to play under the current contract. He's either going to get something done or probably retire.
You don't think he'll play at all under this deal?
I don't think so. I think
that would be
you can't rule out the idea of retirement with him because he's played for about 10 years, and he's always said he'd reassess his career after 10 years.
Gotcha.
And, you know, the difference between him and Chris Long is that his role isn't changing. Chris Long retired and made it easy. They said they were changing his role. Malcolm, they're not changing it. So that's why he won't. But if they're going to keep it that way and not pay him even a little bit more, then that might force him into retirement.
John McMullen joins the conversation here. John, now do you think he'll be in for minicamp, mandatory minicamp next week?
I do not. I don't think there's enough time, and the fines are basically meaningless for a player of Malcolm's stature. And when you do rework the deal, and I agree with what Jeff said, it'll ultimately be done, and we won't be talking about it week one. You can just waive those fines, which I think are about $80,000. So I just think the timing's not going to be there to get it done at this stage. But I kind of wrote about that as well and talked about the retirement part of it, and there's a lot of tread off Malcolm's tire, and he's got a lot of other interests. So I did say you do have to throw that in the mix a little bit, but I think it's very, very unlikely. I think the Eagles know how important he is to that defense, and they'll ultimately get something done. This is not the first time this has happened. It happened a couple years ago with Brandon Graham. They quietly tweaked his contract in the summer, and I expect the same thing to happen with Malcolm.
Yeah, the summer is a great time to do it, John, because when you do that and, everybody's on vacation, because really the Eagles don't want to have to do this. It looks like they cave a little bit, but as you mentioned, they've done it before. But it's a great time to do it in like the first 2 weeks of July when nobody in the NFL, everyone's on vacation, nobody's working, and it goes away just as fast as it came.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of like the Friday news dump for the NFL because it's the only time that nobody's paying attention to it every day. So, yeah, stuff like that tends to get done in the dead time. And it is. I don't know. There's a lot of ways to look at it. I mean, the issue is, and even more recent was the Jason Kelsey contract because Jason's issue was his guaranteed money was up. Almost all of Malcolm's guaranteed money is up. So it might be just as simple as guaranteeing the final 2 years of his deal, putting some incentives on there as well to make up. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a big ballyhoo thing, and I think it's more likely it'll be something like that. Maybe you extend him 1 year and just guarantee the rest of the money, which they're going to pay anyway. So I think it's going to be something of that nature.
Now, I heard, John, a rumor that you and several other Eagles beat reporters who are there every day have decided to cover any fines incurred by Malcolm Jenkins because after losing Chris Long in the locker room, you guys cannot afford to lose Malcolm Jenkins every single day because the notepads will dry up quickly. That's what I heard.
Yeah. Hey, this locker room, as you know, is great as far as people and being professional. I mean, I think, we talked about Chris Long just won the PFWA Good Guy Award for the second consecutive season. Everybody's supposed to talk to us. It's in their contracts. It's how the NFL is set up, the system, but not everybody does. And guys like Malcolm who stand up there and speak good times and bad, win or loss, and if you want him, he will make time, and I'm very impressed by that. I'm always very impressed by that.
John McMullen talking a little NFL with us, a little football at 4 here on the Sports Bash. And let's dive back into this whole bizarre Joe Douglas story, what's happening with the Jets. Are the Jets jetsing this?
Yes.
There's nothing bizarre about that.
I guess it's
It's
bizarre here
unbelievable.
with a well-run organization to see how they are absolutely just like vomiting on themselves here.
Well, there's a couple different kind of things going out there and whispers, and I'm interested to hear what Jeff has heard as well. Now, from what I understand, they got into negotiations, and it's not about Joe's deal. It's about the budget for the department. Now, if that's true, that's the Jets being the Jets. That's the jetsiest thing ever.
Yep.
I mean, that is absurd. We're talking about maybe $1 million to $2 million, $2 million at the most, and you're going to walk away from a candidate because you're not going to give them that kind of budget. And understand, remember, when we always talk about the salary cap, essentially what we're saying when we criticize teams, we're criticizing how they allocate those assets because everybody has the same salary cap. Everybody's got to spend up to a certain floor. So when you do criticize a team, you're really criticizing the allocation. When you talk about front offices, there's no salary cap. So the good teams are the good teams, and they do and spend whatever they need to do to put together a great organization. And as I said, if that truly ends up as the hang-up and costs them to go in another direction, that's the jetsiest thing ever.
It really is. I probably have heard same as you, John, that going into this thing weeks ago, that you knew the Jets, and because of the relationship there with Gase and Douglas, that's who who Gase really wants. And then I had heard from people close to Joe that he wanted the job as long as it checked out. It checks out. Obviously, here what we're hearing is it's not checking out, and of course, it is the jetsiest thing. I've heard and read what you mentioned about the budget not being up to speed or what Joe Douglas would want. I've also heard that perhaps the offer itself to Joe, someone close to Joe told me today, said he made her heard it wasn't satisfactory. And maybe one goes in hand with the other. That, look, if you're not even going to give me the budget to run the team the way I want, then you better pay the Jets dysfunction tax to me. And it doesn't sound like that they're willing to even do that. You know, when the Cleveland Browns acquired Jarvis Landry and paid him all that money, the Browns knew they had to pay the Browns dysfunction tax to get to where they wanted to be. The Jets don't seem willing to do that.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, if one thing, I almost hope, to be honest, from the Jets' perspective, that it is about not wanting to pay Joe what he thinks he's worth. So if it's just about that and you think he's not worth that money on a contract, I can kind of understand it. I don't agree with it. But on the other side of the coin, if it is the budget for the department, I think that's so much worse. I think if you're agreeing to Joe's terms to be the general manager, and then you're balking at what he wants to do the job that he thinks he needs to be successful, I think that's 100 times worse. So from their perspective, like I said, I hope it's, he wants $2.5 million, whatever, and they only want to give $2 million to a GM, whatever number you want to throw out there. It's bad, but it's not as bad as the other avenue. Either way, you're right. With that organization, with their reputation, with that head coach who's already got his own reputation of not getting along with people, this should have been a no-brainer. And they should have went $500,000, even $1 million above what they wanted to go, just to make themselves look good.
You also consider, John and Mike, Joe Douglas is coming from here, the Eagles' vantage point, where the Eagles are one of the, I'd say, if you go look around the NFL, the Eagles have more people in their scouting and analytics department with the word director in their title than any other team in the NFL. I mean, they have an assistant scouting director, a national scouting director, a scouting director, and then same thing with their analytics staff. They had two guys who basically had the same title with Barry and Alec Hallaby, but clearly Barry has more. So that shows that Jeffrey Lurie puts more money than almost any team into that front office that John's talking about. He's pouring resources to the point where some people say, man, are there too many chefs spoiling the brew? But the bottom line is he's spending that money. So Joe has that to evaluate. It's not like Joe's coming from Cincinnati, which is another organization known for not spending any money on its scouting. He's coming from one of the top organizations to do it.
Yeah, and it's interesting from the Eagles' perspective. I think their assumption was Joe was gone.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they had started to go in a different direction already, and the fact that Andrew Berry was going to kind of sit in that role. And now all of a sudden, if Joe's going to be back, maybe you do have too many chefs in the kitchen, and maybe it does become a bit of an issue. But
they were hiring people in anticipation of this, right?
Yeah. When Andrew came in, he's Howie's executive vice president of football operations. Andrew's title is vice president of football operations. This just created a new title, and at the time they spun it as adding talent to the front office. But they knew they were going to lose Joe at some point, sooner rather than later. And as I said, I think the assumption was they were going to lose him now, and they started to turn that corner. Jeffrey Lord's kind of intimated that, and even said, when you're successful, you're going to lose executives. They kind of thought he was out the door. And now all of a sudden he's coming back in the door.
Well, what did you think, both you guys, that they've talked to Douglas like, hey, like, are you going to take this job? And I mean, like,
here he is at practice, right? He's at OTAs right now.
Yeah.
Right, like, so this isn't like a secret. It's not like he's trying to
No.
He is not interviewing behind their backs trying to keep it a secret. So you would think they had a lot of conversation. Something had to be atomically blasted between the Jets and their front office conversations. I mean, it has to show total ineptitude between the interviewers, the owners, and everything. Because how about the story that came out that said the Jets don't like that Joe Douglas thinks that he's the guy getting the job?
Yeah, the Jets don't like egg in their face. That's what they don't like, and that's what it looks like.
You could tell that kind of leaked out when it became known that they were having difficulties hammering down the deal. And it's like the Jets are concerned that people around the league think it's Joe Douglas's job to have if he wants it. And that's a clear indication of an organization trying to prepare its fan base for Plan B. And hey, we've said it and we'll say it again. It's a very Jetsian thing to do. And it's one of the main reasons the Jets are the Jets.
It's funny because it's a little bit like the Tyronn Lue situation with the Lakers, right? Because once it didn't happen, there were two narratives that came from different factions of reporters. One was Tyronn Lue does not have the ability to hire his coaches, so he is not going to go there and become head coach. And then the other reporters were leaking out, well, the Lakers have moved on to their next target. They just have different guys in mind. It's like, well, wait a minute. Which one is it? And it feels that way here with the Jets. They're trying to bury the obvious by creating other narratives. Oh, we have Scott Fitterer. We have other guys that we like. Yeah,
and think about this, Jeff. If Mike McCagnon hires Matt Rule and lets Matt Rule pick his coaches, none of this is even an issue.
Yeah,
Mike's
amazing.
the GM.
Yeah.
Matt Rule is the head coach. But they wouldn't allow him to take the coaching staff. They have to go in a different direction. They hire Adam Gase, who starts a coup and wins the coup, and now you have this giant mess. Well, it is unbelievable.
This goes back to what John and I were basically hearing weeks ago, which is that the Jets and Douglas make sense as a marriage. Douglas would like to be there. The Jets seemingly would like to have him. However, if it doesn't work, it's because the Jets are going to Jets. And that's basically what's going on here. The Jets. Now think about it.
I find the story to be fascinating that a corporation of this level can screw something up that seemingly goes on every day,
or was almost foolproof. Just give him what he wants because you want him. Let him accept because he wants to it, and then you move on.
It really is. I mean, when you have two sides that want to be in business together and you find a way to screw it up, it's tough to do. And it's when you talk about, I mean, if you think about it from that perspective, and again, throw out any number you want, and you're haggling over a business, what's the salary cap now in the NFL? How much money did the Jets spend on players like Le'Veon Bell and C.J. Mosley? This is not a lot of money in the scheme of the NFL. And this is an organization that does probably have to pay, as Jeff said, a little bit of a dysfunction tax. What's the big deal?
Yeah, you have to.
It's amazing.
They probably don't see that way. Like, hey, you got to pay me more because you guys are dysfunctional.
I think the Browns totally knew that when they signed Jarvis Landry and made him like the third highest paid wide receiver at the time because they knew he could leave in free agency. So they had to really overpay him to keep him.
Well, and the second part is it's not like Joe's walking in there and saying, I want to be the highest paid GM and I want a bigger budget than anybody in the history of the NFL. It's not. So if from his perspective, from his side, if what he wanted was outrageous, then you can kind of see the Jets part of the equation and say, okay, they had to move in a different direction. That's not the case.
Right.
So it is one-sided. It's the Jets.
Now, here's an interesting thing, because we talked about the idea of, well, have the Eagles already prepared to move on and what happens if he doesn't take the job? But you can almost look at it from the other angle, which is Jeffrey Lurie may say he thought was definitely out the door. There's a chance to retain him, and it may only cost him a little bit of a bump up. I mean, he's not going to obviously match what the Jets are offering, but maybe, $500,000 more and be able to keep him for a year and think, that's a bargain. I thought I was going to lose this guy to the Jets, and now I have a chance to get back into the race, or the quote-unquote race here, bump up his pay, and maybe he'll stay.
Yeah, I mean, he's done it in the past. I wrote about Jeffrey and, Howie Roseman, Chip Kelly going back and forth. A lot of people forget. Look, when you lose, and the Jets are a perfect example of this, when you have these power struggles and somebody loses a coup, they don't stay in the organization. Mike McCagnon leaves the organization. The loser leaves. In the case of Howie Roseman, Jeffrey gave him a new title and more money to go on the other side of the business building and say, be my safety net in case this guy falls flat on his face, which ultimately happened. Yeah. Which ultimately happened, and he was able to bring him back over to the personnel side. Now, who's to say? You're right. Maybe he kicks Joe's salary up a little bit. Maybe he gives him the GM title because the Eagles don't have a GM title-wise. And that creates a little bit of goodwill from Joe's standpoint. And you have this great system they've set up for a number of years in the past. We've seen with guys like Eric DaCosta and George Patton who continuously turn down interviews because usually teams looking for GMs are bad teams and bad organizations. So guys who are smart and tend to have other options or believe in themselves, in the case of DaCosta, he waited a long time before taking over for Ozzie Newsome. I did the numbers. George Patton's turned down the Jets 3 times, but he's turned down 13 different interviews in this league over the last number of years. What is it,
Jets and Cleveland and some other team that's probably tried to get him 5 or 6 times?
and the hope is eventually you take over for Rick Spielman, whatever that might be. But guys have done that, and guys have been successful in that secondary role, and maybe that's the way it shakes out for Joe. But he's told me he wants to be a general manager. He wants to be in charge. But obviously not bad enough to want to be in charge at all costs.
And one thing to consider, what I hear a lot from people I talk about in the league, and it's pretty obvious, but sometimes it needs to be reminded to you, unlike head coaches, unlike players, GM opportunities usually come along once, and if you fail at it, even if it's not your fault, it's very hard to become a second-time GM somewhere else when you failed the first time. You'll never hear from Mike McCagnon again as a GM, or John Idzik or anybody else who walked through those doors before that. Right, so that's why Joe's got to really
do
be
a decent job. He was able to get some players there. They had a nice draft last year. Like some people had asked me.
Yeah, that's my point. Is it might not have been his fault. Like John was saying, if he got to hire the coach he wanted, maybe things would have been fine.
That whole situation is even more bizarre. The fact that the coach took a power play on the GM that whole thing with the Jets is even bizarre.
The coach pulled a power play, much like here, but even quicker. The coach
has a coach a game
on the guy who hired him on the same year. They haven't even played a game.
They didn't even have a reason to have a fight yet.
And not to mention, he wasn't even the first choice of coach. They went to hire somebody else. So the schleprock they brought in secondary said, "I don't want the GM here. Get him out."
God, I love the Jets.
I have almost. In a weird way, I have incredible respect for Adam Gase because it's astonishing he got another opportunity so quickly after what went on in Miami And again, he turns on the guy who hires him immediately. It's incredible to have that kind of ego.
The Jets are really the Costanza of the NFL. They are so inept that you're thankful that they're there just to laugh at. It's just really funny.
Yeah.
People think they were turning the corner based on the moves
That's
of the Cagnon.
That adds to it. They were actually having a really good offseason.
Yes.
They got Le'Veon Bell at below market value. They drafted the best player in the draft. They have Sam Darnold. They were starting to look better than the Giants, and now everybody's looking. It's like Kermit sipping tea. The Giants are looking at them like, man, you are saving us from how bad it looks on our end right now.
Yeah, you see, that duel between the Giants and Jets has been pretty amazing. When Dave Gettleman does something stupid, the Jets just up the ante.
Hold my beer.
It's like a high-stakes poker game. Everybody's all in at Met Stadium.
So anything interesting happened at the NovaCare complex today?
Eagles went bowling today.
Oh, so the Jets one-upped them and went to Topgolf.
Yeah.
That's how you get Joe Douglas in there.
That's the new thing in the NFL. You cancel the last day of OTAs or the last day of minicamp, and you have these team-building exercises. Vic Fangio did it out in Denver as well today. The Jets did it, as Jeff mentioned. The Eagles did it with OTAs and bowling. They did it a couple of years ago. They went paintball.
Yeah.
Was it? I don't know. It's like it's a copycat league, and that's where we are. That's what I tweeted. It's cute and fun now, and everybody does it.
I think Belichick, and not surprisingly, actually started this. John, didn't he a while ago do this?
Yeah, he's done it. And I think it speaks more of, and I wrote about this last week, is that OTAs are not that important, spring work. I mean, for the younger players, yes, because they have to get up to speed. But for the veteran players, I mean, Jim Schwartz and Mike Rowe practically admitted it doesn't mean that much for those guys. And that's why Jim isn't worried at all about Malcolm Jenkins not being a voluntary work. It's just it's tough to get anything done in the current environment where there's no pads, there's no contact whatsoever. It's football. How much can you really get done?
John McMullen at JF McMullen. Voluntaries are done. Mandatory starts Tuesday. We'll see who's in, who's not, what they can get done, and then the NFL will take a little siesta, a little time off. But we will be all over the football that there is. We'll start previewing the divisions and look at individual teams. Football at 4 lives on, even in the summer, right here on the Sports Best. Thank you, pal.
See you, Johnny.
Thanks, guys.